I'm the director of the Children of the Code project. The Children of the Code project is a social education project. Our intention is to basically change how people think about reading. Now, one of the things that's going on here is you've got this great network, a lot of administrative horsepower, a lot of high level power at the universities, all working together. All this is very good. This is great, this kind of crosstalk, this kind of synergy. And as you'll see as we go forward, when you look at what is it that's causing this literacy crisis to perpetuate itself generation after generation for so long, fundamentally, the underlying cause is that we think we understand literacy, and we don't. It's we think we understand what reading is, and we don't. So the Children of the Code project is basically about changing how we think about this as a whole. In the course of our project, we have interviewed 120 or so experts, ranging in sciences from the neuroscientists that are studying how sound components are represented in the brain, to archaeological linguists who discovered where the letter Z came from, to child psychologists who are looking at what are the consequences of protracted struggle on somebody's self-esteem, to juvenile justice professionals who are looking at the correspondence and correlation between reading-related difficulties and social pathologies, to the person who's in charge of all research at the Department of Education, the Institute of Educational Sciences, who's watching over the country as a whole with respect to research, to the czar of American reading for 25 years, who reported to the president and to Congress and who sat on top of research committees that were studying reading-related issues for 20-something years, both in the United States and around the world. We're doing is cross-connecting all of that into what we hope will be a compelling experience that reframes how we think. Well, the first part of this that I think is really helpful to get a ground from is that Children of the Code for us has two different meanings. And the first one has to do with its effect on us as a people, as human beings.
The bottom line of this is that the big step between us and animals is indeed language, but the big step between civilization and more primitive forms of human society is written language.
The fact is that the invention of a writing system, and then the adoption of writing systems around the world has been the thing that gives our modern societies their predominant character.
Well, it has enormous metacognitive implications. The power is this, that you can not only think in ways that you could not possibly think if you did not have the written word, but you can now think about the thinking that you do with the written word.
Once we start writing, we are able to then reflect back upon what we have written, and we enter into this kind of recursive relation to our own written signs. And so only then a certain degree or experience of self-reflection that we now sort of take for granted comes into being.
I wish I could take the time that deserves. I mean, we do a 6-hour event just on that point, right? This becoming code users, what it did to the human brain, is as radical in its effect on us as walking upright, as learning to speak. I mean, it's a fundamental point in the development of human beingness in the world. It affected everything about the emergence of our religious systems, the emergence of Western civilization in Greece. And by the way, let me back up for just a second and say, what I'm showing you today is going to be maybe 15 or 20 small video clips that are culled out of over 450 hours of collected interviews that we've done. There's 67 videos that are actually available online on our website and that you can use in your projects. They're free. You can grab them from the web and plug them right in on your web pages. And they cover all of this in a way that I obviously aren't going to have time for today. But again, back to this, there's this, it's important as a backdrop as we try to think about what's the challenges that children and adults face coming into this, to understand that this code is the most powerful single invention in the history of history. It's changed everything about civilization. It is the very operating system of civilization. And in becoming code users, it changes our brains. It changes how we think, how we remember, how we reflect, how we communicate. The difference between oral language peoples who have never experienced literacy and literate people is a radical shift in language itself, in its ability to make references to things not now, not present. It's awesome. And it's an important thing to understand as a backdrop. But there's another dimension to it, what we mean by children of the code. And it's probably, for everybody here, the more significant one. And that is that approximately 100 million people in the United States alone are living lives somewhere between seriously and severely diminished because of their difficulty with coming through this code.
%70 approximately of young African American kids can't read. 70%. If you look at Hispanic kids, 65 to 70%.
And as we know, a majority of students do not read at the proficient level.
A majority of students do not read at the proficient level. Now, this is the United States Department of Education's national stats. Different states assess things in different ways. But it's pretty close any way you cut it. You're still talking about a significant dimension of our population that is below proficiency with reading throughout their entire K-12 experience. And so I assume, again, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence. There's a lot of people here that have obviously spent a lot of time in the field of literacy. But it's important for us to have enough of a sync, enough of a common understanding to proceed into the next stage of this conversation. So let me just take a second and say that, you know, basic, when we say basic, we're talking about an instrumental ability to work out a recognition of a word, right? When we talk about proficiency, we're talking about the ability to read that's so fluent that it's as transparent as listening, right? So whether I'm reading something that you gave me or I'm listening to you say it, it would make no difference to the access that I have to its meaning, right? So it's at that level that we're saying most of the children in this country, according to the national assessment system that monitors the country as a whole, are below proficiency with reading throughout their entire K-12 experience. So what that means is that instead of literacy being this gateway, this interface to all of the material that's assumed they're going to learn throughout education, the literacy mechanism itself is interfering with, obscuring, exacerbating the difficulty of education. So everything about school, everything about education is made worse because of this one point. And of course, this translates to a massive number of adults.
93 million adults out of a total adult population of around 221 million are at basic literacy levels or below basic.
The effects that this has are just stunning. Now, obviously, I'm going to play some of these clips. Again, I don't want to insult your intelligence, but I think it's important for us to have this common ground. The thing that most of us are familiar with is the academic danger.
When 68% of fourth graders are below proficiency, we know that the odds, the probability of those children catching up and becoming proficient readers in 4 years from there, or by the time they graduate from high school, are very slim.
If you know a child's reading ability by the third grade, you generally have a very high ability to predict whether they're going to graduate from high school or not, and what their abilities are going to be and what their future is going to be.
My grades kind of started slipping a lot. I just decided, you know, I'm not a good reader, there's no hope for me. Yeah, I just stopped kind of doing my work.
I'm troubled by the platitudes about educational opportunity in the United States as if it were sufficient to have kids attend school and press them to achieve at higher levels when the basic fundamental problem is not being addressed of their command of the tools that enable them to achieve academically and thereby gain access to the social and economic mainstream.
So as I said, that's kind of the most obvious part of all this that all of you are familiar with. I think that in order to really understand this, the more important pieces have to do with what this does to the cognitive health of people and what it does to them emotionally. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this journey in our short time together in which we go through both what's at stake with literacy, which I know you're all very familiar with in different ways, and what's involved in becoming literate, where we will look at, as we progress, what's involved from a point of view of the child from the time that they're born until the time that they hit this obstacle course wall and begin the process of learning to read. What goes off? What aspect of childhood learning trajectories are predictive of learning, and what can we do to intervene with them? As a backdrop, though, I want to touch on the cognitive and emotional pieces.
If I read a book and then I feel like a lot smarter.
Does reading make you smarter? The answer is yes. Crystallized intelligence is just massively built by reading itself, okay? Independent of education, independent of fluid intelligence.
Ultimately, the measures of your cognitive abilities tend to move down in the direction of your reading abilities.
So cognitively, learning to read creates a very unique exercise environment for the brain. There's nothing else like it. And it is a result of that process that we become, as you heard in the earlier piece on the power of writing, it's how we become so critically self-reflective. It's how we become so abstractly reflective. It's all built into the way that literacy and language interact. And so children that are not learning to read well, their brains aren't being exercised in ways that are critical to success in the way the world works today. So it's more than just reading, is my point, yeah? The significance of reading goes way beyond reading. It goes way beyond whether or not somebody can get at information on the other side of this interface, this other side of this technology. I think, however, that the most significant dimension of all this has to do with emotion.
What must it be like to come to school every day, right? And school is going to be all about the thing that you don't do well.
Spending any amount of time in classrooms where children are working on beginning reading instruction, you can almost watch children who are struggling begin to turn off and exhibit behaviors that are going to interfere with their learning.
I remember feeling pretty dumb.
I wasn't smart. I thought I was not smart because I couldn't read like everybody else could.
Growing up, I thought it was me the whole time. I thought something was wrong with me.
The spiral starts, and so the learning problems get more intense, the emotional overlay gets more intense. You can see a child literally who started off being fine begin to wither on the vine as they begin to struggle at school and lose so much of their self-esteem in the process.
So we're talking about, and as we go forward, we'll frame this thing and go deeper into what reading is. But for right now, even inside the understanding that's common here, what we're talking about is an exercise that's unique and that's distinct from anything that a child would encounter until such time as they do encounter this, that has significant, deep implications to how their cognitive machinery of their brain develops. And it has a really profound impact on their relationship with themselves emotionally. And as we go forward, we'll see that as probably the biggest single thing. This is what translates into all of the social pathologies. It's not just that somebody has difficulty reading. It's that the collateral effect of protracted difficulty with learning to read affects how they feel about learning in general. It affects the health of their learning in general. Now, the costs of this are staggering. Again, just to play the videos in here would take more time than we've got. I refer you to the website for these things. But I will give you some headlines. With respect to the economy, the annual cost of literacy-related difficulties is greater than the conversation about the $700 billion going on in Congress today. It's stunning. It's more than the war in Iraq all years so far, every year. It's estimated by the Department of Education that about $300 billion a year in just public education money is involved, not counting the collateral expenses like health care In the healthcare industry, it's estimated that about 40% of hospitalizations and surgeries are an unnecessary consequence of literacy-related errors. Now take that towards the $1 trillion plus healthcare expense in this country. With respect to our democracy, I interviewed the chairman of the National Literacy Panel, who was also a member of the National Reading Panel and the president of the International Reading Association. He's such a reading expert, he was brought into Florida at the end of the 2000 election. Remember, I don't know if you saw that movie on HBO about the hanging chads. Remember all the hanging chads stuff the press was all caught up about at the end of the 2000 election? Well, he was kind of brought in on the side by the newspapers in Florida to analyze the ballots from a different perspective. And what he came to was that there were more ballots that would have voted for Gore that were disqualified for literacy-related errors than all of the hanging chads combined. So literacy actually skewed the result of the presidential election. When you look at the correlation between poverty, on and on and on, the correspondence comes back to show us that this is a massive, deep, national problem that affects our society. The thing that's causing this problem, that repeatedly causes this problem, is the shallow, superficial thinking of all of us about what reading is and where are the intervention points to change the trajectory of the children, adults, and the country as a whole with respect to it.
We seem to go back and forth between the pole of we shouldn't teach the code or we should teach it, but teach it in this super simple way that doesn't actually work and hasn't worked in English for 500 years.
There's the born-again phonics people. There's the reborn-again whole language people. And they're actually more like cults than religions.
Is why do people dichotomize phonics and whole language? Why do they look at qualitative versus quantitative methodologies? Why do they look at cognitive versus social and emotional development? The common theme is a lack of knowledge. What pervades those dichotomies is a lack of understanding that goes directly to how we prepare professionals in education. There is no reason why that kind of concrete thinking should exist, but it does.
I mean, I talked about the process of teacher stupidification, where if you remove all authority and autonomy from teachers and give them a steady diet for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years of just doing what you're told, and you get in trouble if you try to teach in ways that are outside the boundaries, the narrow framework that you've been given, then after 20 years, and I say you continue to get a one-size-fits-all sort of commercial solution, after 20 years, why would a teacher think that it's her job to deal, with struggling readers?
There's so many factors. So just a quick summary right now in terms of what's at stake, right? Again, there's this reading crisis affecting nearly 100 million Americans. Most of the children, to one degree or another, are struggling with this. Reading matters for these reasons of cognitive infrastructure, the development of certain kinds of cognitive infrastructure. It has this academic danger trajectory, which we touched on. The consequences of this emotionally are, all of these, by the way, are videos on the website, which leads to the social danger, the collective costs of nearly $1 trillion. When you look at it, the way that we look at it is, learning to read, the process of learning to read is causing the nation's greatest learning disability. It's actually disabling the learning of a massive dimension of our population. And that if we're going to do something about this, we really need a reframe in how we think about it.
Many education reforms have taken place in the nation. We've had the education governors, we've had education presidents, we've done all of these things, and everybody's had a new solution. But in fact, the problem isn't getting better. The problem's getting worse.
It feels very frustrating that we're not seeing the kind of change we want to see in improvements in reading achievement. And it's hard to understand why that's happening.
The problem is our society's lack of insight into what is involved in acquiring literacy.
That's my favorite quote, 400-something hours. That's my favorite. Because this is a person who's right there at the top of the pyramid in reading research, basically saying the reason this keeps getting propagated, right, is that we as a people really don't understand this. And one of the difficulties, one of the reasons we do, is that those of us that can read well no longer experience this challenge in any way like the people that are struggling with it. I can stand up here and say, I know what it's like to be, you know, an Asian woman or something, right? And I can have a model and an idea about that, but I don't have that experience. And those of us that are on the other side of reading, we no longer have the felt, immediate sense experience of the struggle that's going on in the people that are struggling.
So when we think we're going to fix the reading problem in the country by teaching beginning reading in a particular way, we're fooling ourselves.
If I had my druthers, instructional methods wouldn't be the big deal out there. What would be the big deal is if teachers could ask themselves, what does it take to learn to read?
I think that's a particularly powerful piece, too, when you think that that was the czar of American reading, right? Saying, despite all of the conversation typically that's going on about competing methodologies and products and ideologies and all of that, that if it was up to him, the thing that's most important is that each teacher that's doing this ask themselves, first person, what's going on? How do I learn to understand at a deeper level what's going on? And that's the purpose of our project. So, reading. What is reading? Reading is a completely artificial simulation of language. It's a code-instructed and informed simulated language experience. There's nothing natural about it. It's like a modem. Taking one form of information, converting it to another form of information. Or like a DVD player or a CD player. It's just as abstractly technological. It's just that it happened so long ago, and so many of us do it, that we have this romanticized notion about it. But when we read, something's going on in our brain that's no different than the kind of technological processes of our machinery. It's kind of, one of the metaphors that I like to use is that it's kind of like a player piano. So think of the keys on the piano like phonemes, right? And then there's the part of the forebrain that's taking these elements of the code from the scroll and converting it into playing these keys at just the right time, in just the right order, in just the right way, at just the right speed. Anywhere in that machinery, there's a breakdown, there's a stutter, there's a missing key, there's a stuck key, and it's not intelligible, just like it wouldn't be if you were playing a piano scroll of something Mozart did and 3 or 4 of the keys were missing. You might not be able to understand the music, right? Or if it went too slow or it went too fast. So again, we're talking about something that's radically unnatural.
Learning to read in alphabetic orthography is a very artificial and unnatural act.
It's one of the most complex, unnatural, cognitive interactions that brain and environment have to coalesce together to produce. It's amazing.
It's an incredibly recent invention. Though the alphabet itself is 3,500 years old, and some of us have been, you could go back to reading it on scratching on bones and using tokens and what have you, and the various writing systems that preceded the alphabet. The use of the alphabet as we understand it today, the ability to read English in particular, is less than 500 years old, and it's only been a couple hundred years since there was any real pressure for a massive dimension of humanity or our population to be reading it. And it's only been in the past 25 or 30 years that one of the most unique challenges of literacy has kicked in, which I will come to. So it's an unnatural, recent invention. It's technological. Like I said, it's like a player piano. It's incredibly dependent on the linguistic foundation and the speed of processing in the brain. Anybody understand that? How about now?
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice.
The point being that this thing's really timing precarious. If you think about this, language moves at a particular speed. As you listen to me talk, right, the words differentiate themselves at an incredible rate of speed. This reading machinery has to take this code and convert it into a simulation of that language at roughly the same speed, or it's not intelligible. So reading is this artificial, code-informed and instructed, simulated experience of language. And there's a lot of different components to it in terms of how the brain generates this that need to be understood if we're to get away from this kind of Renaissance cannon fire bombardment of models that we're projecting on children and actually differentiate what we're doing to be more effective. The most significant consequence to protracted learning to read difficulties has to do with the health of learning in children and adults. Most people are pretty much aware of learning as a process of acquiring knowledge, skills, and experience. We like to think about learning as the process of becoming more extensively present. It affects every dimension of our life. What aspect of yourself, for example, isn't learned? What aspect of your knowledge, your sense of yourself, your emotion isn't learned? Now, there's two basic modes of learning that are important to understand if we're to understand the challenge of learning to read and its effect on us. One has to do with unhealthy learning. See, learning can, when you look at it, the thing that most endangers human learning is human learning.
There's a sort of intuition that all of the change that occurs in these learning contexts is positive. That if I throw emotion on, I learn better, right? Not right. That's not correct.
We haven't recognized in modern pedagogy the experience of shame and how it prevents children from learning.
They develop a sense of shame around their lack of capacity. And again, this manifests in lots and lots of different ways. Disinterest, defiance, inattentiveness.
It grows in the brain like a monster. Everything else is degraded. So here I'm growing something that you could say is like a great fear or a great obsession, and its power in the brain is growing and growing and growing.
They begin to say things to themselves like, I'm no good, or I can't do this, which inhibits their ability to maintain attention and actually recruit their cognitive processes.
It's a very maladaptive feedback cycle that you approach a task with anxiety because of concerns about your own performance. That distracts from your attention, your ability to focus on and process the information that's being provided, which impairs your performance more, which increases your anxiety, and this cycle continues to amplify itself.
If they are distracted by the feeling that they cannot do the task well, if they're saying to themselves at the same time, I'm not good at this, I don't like this, this is not fun, other children do this better than I do, I'm never going to learn it. All that talk and that emotional arousal is taking up what people call M space, or cognitive space in the task. And when that happens, those distractions diminish the child's ability to actually do the task that they're now struggling with.
So there's a negative side, there's a dark side to what's happening.
Point being that the challenge of learning to read for a great number of children, once they experience protracted difficulty, once they've had too much difficulty with this, the main consequence of it, right, is it causes children to develop an emotional aversion to the feeling of confusion. Think about that. Just like reading itself happens faster than we're conscious of, it has to, otherwise it doesn't work, right? So what happens when faster than we're even conscious of, we develop an automatic kind of emotional aversion to the feel of confusion. What does it do to our learning generally? Yeah. That's the real consequence of this. It's not just the absence of the positive. It's not just the absence of the ability to read and all that can come from that. Right? It's the collateral effect of what's happening to people's general learning and how that affects their life in so many different dimensions with respect to reading. Now, the next distinction that I think is really important to understand before we go on to deconstructing reading a bit and what we might do differently is to understand the distinction between natural modes of learning and artificial modes of learning. By the way, I noticed that some of you are taking notes. Let me spare you, unless that's your learning style and you need to do that. You've all been given a little card, right? On the card is a web address. If you go to that web address, it'll be a little form, and you can say, I was at this event. You can share a little bit with me about what you learned, what you didn't, what worked, what didn't, which will help me and help the people that support me. And I will send you this booklet. And the booklet will summarize this and more. And we'll also give you links to accessing the 67 plus videos online, which would take more time, again, than I have. So back to where we were here. So natural modes of learning. We are born wired to learn. We come out with our organism oriented to learn our way towards being more extensively present in the world. We come that way. But the kind of natural modes of learning that we come wired for are in relation to what you might say is the sensorially present. What's right here, right now. The child, for example, learning to walk.
So like her first steps, first good steps.
I always have to wait for that's my favorite part. Now, what would happen to the child's learning to walk if they didn't feel themselves falling for a quarter of a second or half a second after they started to fall? They would never learn to walk. They couldn't. The human organism learns by differentiating its own feedback in relation to live interactions in the now present at the level of walking, at the level of listening and talking.
Hello. 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 Hello.
So it's happening now. It's happening present. They can feel it somatically, right, in their mouth and jaw. The sound is real time. They can say something, they can hear it. It's one of the reasons that it's so difficult for deaf children to learn to speak in a way that's really easily intelligible for the rest of us, right? So my point is that natural learning, the kind of learning that children come naturally oriented to be doing, is based on immediate feedback on the edge of their extension into greater capacity. Now let's contrast that with what happens in school, and in particular what happens with reading. Because they're not wired for that. In the case of learning to read, we're talking about something that's incredibly abstract. It's technological. It's artificial. As we'll see as we progress, it's full of all kinds of confusing leftovers from how this technology got to us. And there's no immediate feedback. They don't know when they're right or wrong. Without external support to know that they're right or wrong. Underneath it all, the most important piece in all this is that it's unnaturally confusing. And that's what we're going to come to next. So, with that as a backdrop, what's at stake, which we've talked about kind of the different dimensions of impact on society, on all of us, and on the individual with respect to their cognitive development, their academic development, their emotional health, how that translates into all these social pathologies and expenses and so forth. With that on one peg, and on another, this sense that reading is this artificial simulation of language that's unnatural to the way that our organism functions and requires a lot of things to be just right in order for us to learn to do it. So there's a lot of things that are involved. One of the things is the innate differences that children come with. the innate differences in the way their brain's wired. So if you talk to the National Center for Learning Disabilities or the International Dyslexia Association, and you kind of pound it down through them as to what part of our percentage, what percentage of our population has a difficulty with reading that's a consequence of innate neurobiologically oriented or ordered learning differences or disabilities, that's a percentage that's argued somewhere between 1 and 5%. So when you look at that, most of our children are below proficiency. It's not because of innate neurobiological differences, for the most part. That's certainly a role. It's certainly playing a role, but it's not the big one. Okay, another big component in all this is parents. And parents with low literacy, as we'll see as we progress also, they not only don't practice literacy, right? They don't model literacy. There's not a lot of literacy going on in the home, so the children are not experiencing an adult around them that's modeling literacy. So there's that component. That also, because of the shame factor associated with adult literacy, number one thing that all adult literates have low literates have difficulty with, according to surveys done by ProLiteracy and other adult literacy organizations, is they are ashamed of themselves. And that's one of our big summarizing points as we progress. As a consequence of that shame, just like anything we're ashamed of, we want to avoid it. And so the consequence of that is there's not a lot of literacy materials, there's not a lot of literature, there's not a lot of reading materials in the homes of adults that have low literacy. So all these things are weakening the child's ability to be ready for the challenge of learning to read. Then, of course, there's preschools. Up until very recently, and I interviewed the head of Head Start. Up until a few years ago, it was taboo to think that their job was to get kids ready for reading. It was more social emotional. Now they've come to realize that they can do all you want to get a kid social and emotionally happy, and they hit the wall with reading. If you haven't prepared them for it, that's all out the window anyway. So there's a new shift, a new emphasis in the national policies with respect to early childhood development to get them ready for reading. So these factors contribute to readiness. There's other things that are part of what makes it so confusing. There's the ESL issue that I've heard talked about here today, right? The degree to which children come from a family language environment in which the language that's spoken there is not represented in the print that they're being asked to learn to read with. And the greater the gap, whether it's because they come from a different language or just that the language that they are in at home is different than what they're reading with, the more that this already significant challenge is made worse. One of my favorites, and one of the things I think is least understood, is the motivational issue that surrounds the difference in media availability today. When I was a kid, there was 3 TV stations. Can you imagine that? CBS, NBC, ABC. And if you took this little coat hanger rabbit hook thing and stuck it on the back of the TV set and played around like this, you could get a couple of other TV stations that were running these kind of old rerun things. But there wasn't a lot of intellectual stimulation, things that would really turn on a young person when I was growing up, unless you were willing to take the time to read. Reading was the gateway to intellectual richness for people of my generation, and probably a generation or two further down the line, right? That just isn't true anymore. Kids today have got, 500 cable channels. They got iPods and cell phones and Game Boys and, right? They've got all kinds of opportunities to be stimulated, to experience fun, creative, intellectually rich interactions with the world that don't require any work. They don't require any of the stuff that goes along with reading. Right? So the motivational differences in the landscape today irrelevates our past conversations about literacy. They're just not relevant because the motivation has shifted so much. On the one hand, there's never been a time in human history where literacy was more critical to whether somebody could succeed in the world than there is today. And there's never been a time in human history when it was more difficult to learn to read because it's so hard to learn to read with such minimal benefits compared to all the other intellectually rich, stimulating opportunities a child has. On top of that, I don't know how many, this is one of my favorite things to do, is to hang out with 4- and 5-year-olds and listen to their conversations, right? And to ask them stuff. I mean, I have lots of, if you've done that, If you've dropped into being the fly on the wall, observer, listener to a group of small children talking, and you listen to the complexity of the language they use, the conceptual dexterity and density, the linguistic richness, and you listen to their conversation, and just take a snapshot in your mind of the language complexity that they're using there. And then, there's a contrast. Imagine now them sitting down reading one of these kindergarten books. Why in the world would a kid with all the linguistic power that they demonstrate over here want to read that moronic stuff? My point being is there's so many pieces to this. And this media thing and this motivational is huge. Another dimension, of course, is the reading to learn switch, which everybody's familiar with here, right? In 4th grade, all of a sudden, instead of having this kind of soft, atmospheric thing that says it's okay, we'll get it right, we're going to learn to read, and it's kind of low judgment, all of a sudden, boom, the education system just shifts. It just assumes they can read, and if you can't read, you're in big trouble, right? And in my interviews with kids, and again, these are on the website, we've interviewed about 50 kids in different stages of this and got them to be very candid emotionally about what's going on for them. And it's like they hit a wall. It hurts them. They felt like they were doing okay, then they hit this and they realized they were in big trouble, but they were alone in it. So these things here are a little more dangerous in this kind of environment. There's the dysteachia component. I mean, most of the people that study this say that for the most part, are educators, not because they mean to, but just because the system has incented them to be kind of robotic extensions of protocols of how to teach, rather than first-person learners learning to differentiate what they're doing in relation to what an individual child actually needs, right? So because of that big gap in this kind of model-based approach to teaching, of course, that works across the bell curve. And for everybody it doesn't work for, it makes it worse. It just adds to the confusion that's already inherent in all of this. And this reads into, I mean, we've interviewed people that study the resistance in education to change and, you know, how teachers are trained and all that stuff. But at the core of all of this, what we're really talking about is the child's level of readiness to take on the confusion that's at the heart of learning to read. At the heart of learning to read is this confusion. And if this doesn't happen just right, then children shame out. And we'll go into how all these three things work. First of all, with respect to confusion. So there's different kinds of confusion. It's helpful to take a moment and get clear about. There's this kind of syntactical confusion. Notice the difference between these statements. They all have the same words, but you arrange them a little bit differently, and it's a lot more brain work to figure out what they mean, right? You're probably all familiar with this. It's been passed around the web. I always send like a torpedo back to anybody that posts this to me, saying, yeah, this is great, but it doesn't say anything about teaching reading. It just says what a reading mind can do once they've got good pattern recognition skills. But anyway, even in this case, what it's showing is that it takes a lot longer. The greater the confusion, the longer it takes to work out the confusion. And of course, the problem with reading is you don't have any time. So reading represents a radically artificial form of confusion.
How do you feel when you read?
My brain hurts.
It hurts?
My head started hurting. It's like it kept on boom, 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 just beating. I didn't even know the word. I don't even know what's going on in my head. I didn't. I was like, what is this word? I can't figure it out.
It's pretty difficult, like putting sounds to these symbols, knowing the difference between one and another, and knowing that some are numbers and some are letters, and that you can put them together and they form a completely different thing.
I get confused a lot because I'll sit there and I get frustrated. It's no fun. I don't like reading.
And I can't understand what it's saying.
We're talking about
children experiencing a form of confusion that's unnatural to their organism.
I think that's an interesting and good way to frame things.
Well, in English, get the hook.
I knew the letter names. It was like the sounds and the bigger words and the words that, like, when you sound them out, they aren't pronounced the way they sound.
I mean, I'm sounding them out like I've been taught, but it just ain't, I don't know, it just don't work. Because, you know, they tell you to sound out, and then, you know, you get vowels, and some of them are silent, and it's just like, well, these two work together to make this, and it's like, huh? I mean, it's just like, it's so confusing.
C, K, S, Ch, Sh. O, ow, wa, oo. M, P, P. A, A. R, R. I, E. S, Sh, Z. O, ow, wa, oo. N,
Inconsistencies, absurdities, facts contrary to the etymology that show up in the writing system. It's a mess.
It's a real puzzle, and it's a very arbitrary exercise in orthography to figure out what's what.
Who came up with E-N-O-U-G-H spells enough?
Why do I have one tooth and several teeth, and I go into a restaurant and sit in one booth and there aren't several beef?
You know, oh, by F, I don't hear F making V sounds very often, and it doesn't. In fact, it only does it in of.
I don't know of anything that has more exceptions than reading in English. I mean, English seems to be a total monster.
I suspect that most letters that are in your sort of foveal zone, or the area right around your fixation, are probably being processed pretty much in parallel. So I don't think we need to think of them as, you know, one 25 milliseconds, another 25 milliseconds, but averaged over them, it's going to be about 25 milliseconds, yeah. Very fast, staggeringly fast.
Harry. Our son. Compowered son. Compact son. Compact. Son. Compower son. Comparison. I hate this word.
And that's the majority of our kids who have a tough time. They are slow. They are labored in their reading. They are they're hitting the wall on a lot of these print skills.
The truth is that reading is one of the more complicated of the higher cognitive functions, using attention and rate of processing and sequencing and memory and the linguistic systems and the visual system, and it having to coordinate this dance that's going on. And the more complicated the translation from the orthography to the phonology is in a particular language, the more complicated this processing dance has to be within the brain.
What has to happen is your phonological processor, your orthographic processor, your meaning processor, and your context processor all have to work in concert to identify the written word.
It's an enormous task just to get started, just to go to square one to be able to use the machine, so to speak, in this case, reading and writing.
It's hard won by incredible depth of practice. It's very unsurprising that many people struggle with it.
We should be astonished that so many people do learn to read an alphabetic writing system with relatively inexpert instruction. That's what's remarkable.
The point being that what we're talking about here is this juggle that has to happen. You heard the one person who studies eye tracking and makes inferences based on how people move their eyes in relation to text, makes inferences about what's going on in the brain in order to process it. That work, coupled with the work that shows the difference, for example, between the word bad and dad when pronounced at normal speeds, is less than 1/10 of a second, right? So what we're talking about is kids, when they're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, are in this danger zone where their whole life is in danger, depending upon whether or not their life has prepared them to work out this jigsaw puzzle, this highly confusing, artificially complex jigsaw puzzle at this phenomenal rate of speed of about 1/10 of a second per letter sound in order for it to move at a rate where it can start to become transparent. So, as we've touched on earlier, a lot of this has to do with readiness. This also is longer, this one whole thing is longer than we have time for, but I want to touch on one particular study that I'm sure half of you or more are aware of, but that everybody should be. And that has to do with this meaningful differences. How many people here are familiar with this work? Okay. Briefly, because of our time limitations. So this study was done in which they took a researcher and assigned a researcher to a family with a newborn. At the time that the newborn was born, the researcher would go into the household, right, and hang around for the first 9 months like an aunt or an uncle, showing up at odd hours once every week. So that by the time the child was 9 months old, they could begin the process of being kind of a fly on the wall in the background and record all the words that were going back and forth between the child and the family. And what they found was incredibly significant. It's heralded as one of the most important research studies in the history of education. And all the videos for this are also on our website, also free, and they can be used by all of you that are in this is one of the greatest arguments for early childhood development. Anyway, the point being that when you added it up, and they added up the amount of words that kids were exposed to, kids that came from taciturn families, families that didn't talk as much, heard by the time they were 4 about 12 or 13 million words. Kids that came out of households who were professionals, who talked for a living in one form or another, were hearing 40 to 50 million words. When you think about the difference just there in the cognitive linguistic exercise and the difference of those, it's stunning, it's startling, right? It's huge. And that difference, when you project it over to 4th grade, accounted for all the variation in reading performance, in picture vocabulary tests, intelligence tests, as much as the data will allow in such studies. So the point being is that on top of the purely linguistic language vocabulary, it's building vocabulary, obviously. It's also building the ability to make high-speed phonemic differentiations, right? Differentiations in sound to catch the meaning, right? So it's this deep core exercise. In addition to the linguistic and cognitive dimensions, it had significant emotional dimensions. Because what they found is that parents that talked with children, both kinds, whether they talked a lot or they talked a little, there was a significant portion of the talk that was command and control, what they call business talk. Clean up your room, that kind of stuff. Blow your nose, brush your teeth. Stuff kids aren't particularly happy to be hearing all the time. But the kids that were in more talkative homes were hearing a massively different amount of positive talk. Talk that was encouraging them to participate more, to loop with them, to have more conversation, more dialogue. So that another implication of this work is that not only does it have a radical difference in the preparation to their minds, linguistically, cognitively, and so forth, but it has a significant impact on their self-esteem and on their emotional relationship to language. Because the kids that had less talk going on had a much higher percentage of the talk that is going on being emotionally negative. So this is just one dimension in the many dimensions that are involved in readiness, which feeds into this thing we were talking about earlier, which prepares a child to be ready for that confusion. Now here comes what I think is the big piece. For some reason, as parents, as teachers, as peers, as officials, as educators, across the board, we have unintentionally conspired to cause children who struggle with this to feel like there's something wrong with them. What is it like if you go through this year or two of this corridor feeling confused and associating that confusion with something wrong with you? What does that do to you?
When I was reading to my friend and I got stuck on a word, and then when it was at recess, I heard her talking, saying that like I can't read so good. It made me feel kind of scared that I'm not smart.
When kids are hesitant, disfluent, inaccurate, slow and labored in reading, that is very visible to the peers, and the peers, the other kids, again, look at reading as a proxy for intelligence. It doesn't matter if this kid is already a genius and can do algebra in the 2nd grade. Reading produces particular perceptions. Better said, lousy reading produces a perception of stupidity and dumbness to peers and clearly to the youngster who is struggling. That is the shame.
The greater the number of experiences of reading in which a child experiences shame, the more likely it is that every experience of reading is going to be associated with the expectation of shame.
They said we have to read out of a book or something. I'm afraid they're going to make us read out loud.
I was hoping to be the last person called, but I was the first person called. I didn't really want to read it, but she said you have to, and I was embarrassed to read it, so I had to read it. So I read it, and after that I was really embarrassed.
The ongoing experience of reading almost involves wariness of when is the shame going to occur.
I'd be like, oh my God.
So nervous. I'm nervous. Nervous. Makes me feel shy.
Shy? What does shy mean?
When you're scared to do something and there's a whole bunch of people around.
I'd start sweating. I'd be like, I don't know if I'd literally start sweating, but I would. I'd get real nervous, and you could see that I was getting nervous and embarrassed.
The other kids could make the books talk. They'd pick the books up and words would come out. He said, to me, it just looked like lines and circles and squiggles. I had no idea where the words were. The teacher began hassling me because I wasn't able to read. And by the end of October, the kids were making fun of me because I couldn't read. And I realized it wasn't going to be too long before my mom and dad found out that I wasn't doing my job. He said, so I was scared. I was really scared. He said, but I was also a real resourceful kid. And I looked around the room and I noticed there was another kid in the class who couldn't read. This kid couldn't read a lick. And yet nobody made fun of him because he couldn't read. And the teacher didn't hassle him because he couldn't read, because he was deaf. He wore a hearing aid. He had a hearing loss. And because he was deaf, no one expected him to read on time. He said, so I figured in my 6-year-old mind, the solution to my problem was to convince everyone that I was deaf. And if I could convince everyone I was deaf, they'd stop hassling me about the reading. He said, so I went on a one-man campaign to convince everyone in my life that I couldn't hear. He said, and everything was fine until June. I said, well, what happened in June, Dan? He said, my mom and dad sat me down the last day of school in June in the 1st grade and said, Dan, we're really worried about your hearing. You don't seem to be able to hear. We've taken you to hearing doctors and audiologists all over Cape Cod. Nobody can figure out what it is. So we've made an appointment for you. And you're going to go to Boston Children's Hospital next week. And you're going to stay there for 4 days and 3 nights. And they're going to do exploratory ear surgery and have your adenoids surgically removed. And this 6-year-old kid went through 3 days of surgery rather than tell his parents what he had done. Can you imagine the trauma of a 6-year-old child going through surgery that only he knows he didn't need?
She would go to the grocery and she would get the wrong thing. She'd just think, well, that's what I deserve. That's what I was supposed to get. You know, she just had no self-worth because it had been just shamed out of her because she couldn't crack the code. She couldn't learn. She couldn't do what everybody else was doing. The pain and the shame that people feel. People talking about walking back in the school and actually getting sick at their stomach, you know, because they remember how painful it was and how hurtful it was.
Shame and avoiding embarrassment are at the heart of almost every story we get from adults who come into adult literacy programs. It runs the gamut from the mother who receives notes from her children's teacher but tosses them in the waste can because she doesn't want to admit to her children that she can't read the notes that are coming from the teacher. The truck driver who goes to a colleague and says, I can't read Joe's writing, can you tell me what this note says? The person who never fills out a questionnaire at work but says, well, I didn't have my glasses today, I need to take this home, and takes it home and has his wife read it to them and then comes back with the filled out form the next day to work. These stories recur over and over and over.
This is the part that gets me. If we're honest with ourselves, just today, if you just pay attention today, you'll realize that every one of us, human beings, we go through life trying to circumnavigate the things that will cause us to feel shame. So what happens when learning causes shame? What happens when the way we've learned has caused us to learn that the confusion we feel is some kind of a reflection of something wrong with us that we feel ashamed of? What happens to our learning? That's the significance of this conversation. That's what's at stake. Even deeper and bigger and broader than all these other dimensions. And it's the cause of these other dimensions. I wish I had time to play this section. This also is well over our whole time, just the videos here. But I recommend them to you because this really tells the story of how this shame is not just an emotional, collateral thing, an unfortunate side issue. It's fundamental to the cognitive ecology. It's fundamentally necessary to learning that shame not be in the way. And when shame is in the way, it's disabling the learning. And this is disabling more people's learning than all of the learning disabilities we keep track of. I want to speak a little bit about how these things kind of come together. At the heart of this challenge, remember we were talking about less than 1/10 of a second per letter sound to work this out, right? It's this incredibly fast machinery that has to cohere in the brain just the right way in order for all this to work. The source of the difficulty in it, in English in particular, is what I call the First Millennium Bug. Y'all remember the Y2K bug thing? This great concern that a little bit of code error was going to radiate out into the world and create the apocalypse and all that stuff, right? It's stunning. But how many of you heard of the Y1K bug? Yet you're wrestling with it every day. At the root of the literacy problem is a correspondence issue, an unnaturally confusing correspondence between letters and sounds. That this is also an hour plus of videos to go into, that tracks the story of how writing came from the Romans and basically how a king of England resurrected English writing for the people of England, for him to be able to communicate in order to raise money, to run his wars in Europe with the nobility. It wasn't something that everybody was expected to read. In fact, when they put it together, they weren't concerned with whether the peasantry of England could read. There's a story of the...
Since our king has started writing in English, we're now going to start keeping our own records in English.
And a group of scribes...
writing of this 120 people laid the foundation for standard English.
At the core...
In this kind of literate culture, highly literate culture, it's easy to forget that the system we have learned is a system that is based on a series of accidents that result in layers of complexity.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
The alphabet that we use to write English now was not created for English. It was created for Latin.
The English language has about 40 different phonemes that are significant, by which we mean sound values that your ear picks up in order to make the distinctions that make meaning. Our alphabet only has 26 symbols, and so therefore we're always compromised in certain areas by having to represent sounds with symbols that weren't designed to suit those sounds.
Anyway, that goes on. That's one of what I call the greatest story never told, and it weaves all the way to, you know, a war between President Roosevelt and the Congress and the Supreme Court in 1906 about whether presidents are allowed to change the spelling of things. I mean, it's a story that goes for 500 years. That's the undercarriage to why our system is so confusing. And the point that I bring it up is not because I'm an advocate for reforming the code per se. That's another whole conversation. But I am an advocate for stopping to blame the children and the adults that struggle with this, because how in the hell can we blame them for this mess? Especially when we consider its consequences. Now, as you heard, again, back to the 1/10 of a second per letter sound correspondence, right? What we're talking about is having to disambiguate. The word decoding that's often used in reading is totally misorienting. You could say a modem does a decoding job where there's a really clear correspondence between one thing and it decodes across the gap. The problem with reading is disambiguation, getting through the ambiguity to a coherent representation of the word. And the thing that's taken the brain so much time is working through this confusion.
It's almost as though you have to mesh with that code in a time sync so that that sequencing and processing can happen, you know, in a kind of parallel way, so that all of those gears have to mesh. That's a lot of gears to mesh.
What we're really doing is we're taking something that is a nightmare for computation, and yet we have to turn it into, as we mature, both as language users but also as readers and writers, we have to automatize it so that we don't have to think about those details.
That is critically important, to the extent that I have to invest real cognitive energy in figuring out what that word is. I've lost the meaning of the sentence. It's gone, right?
The problem with automatization is that at any step, if you've got a slowdown step, if any piece of that enterprise has a block, or you can't hold enough of the information, the whole house of cards falls apart.
So at the heart of the struggle that the brain's going through is juggling this puzzle fast enough to generate this simulated language at the rate that it's necessary for it to be comprehensible, given the way the brain's conditioned to listen to regular human language. So I'm going to summarize in our remaining time. I'm sorry it was kind of compressed. I like to do these things as 3-hour versions and 6-hour versions, and the hour-and-a-half versions always are compressed. But I do refer you to the website for more details on it. So what we're talking about here then is there's this early developmental trajectory that determines to what degree a child is ready for instruction. If they're off trajectory for the kind of instruction that they're getting, they're in great danger. Now, getting ready involves literacy also, like we said, because adult literacy informs parental knowledge about all this. It informs parental involvement. It informs parental vocabulary. So all of this is connected to the field that children are growing in that establishes their trajectory. The weaker their trajectory, the more dependent they are on instruction to compensate for their trajectory. Now, before I go into this final part of the shame piece, let me ask you a question. You know, like that Family Feud game where they say the top answers are on the board? What's the #1 answer to the #1 adult fear? Exactly. What is it we're asking kids to do in school? I mean, it's the thing we're all most afraid of, and yet it's what we're asking kids to do, and we're asking them to do it in relation to feeling confused during the takeoff stage with this mess. I submit to you that that's why public speaking is such a fear for us as adults, is just remembering that. Now this shame, as I said, to the extent that kids come with the right trajectory and they're met with the right kind of instruction, they experience what's called Matthew effects. And there's also videos about this and research about this. And in that situation, because they have good vocabulary and they have good letter knowledge, the thing starts to feed itself. It bootstraps itself positively, and they just take off, and they go on to other issues and other problems. And if they read enough and they get enough interesting material, this is no longer a problem for them. They're on to other stuff. But if they're weak on this trajectory because of language, because of self-esteem, because this takes a lot of emotional resilience to hang in there with the frustration, if they're weak and the instruction doesn't meet them, then they're overwhelmed by this confusion, and they start this downward spiral. And again, this downward spiral is initially triggered by ambiguity overwhelm, confusion overwhelm, because of what's going on with this code. It leads to a stutter in the flow. And you hear that in the hesitation, start, stop of the struggling reader's voice. That leads to a self-consciousness where they remember, oh, instead of being kind of in the reading, they fall out of the reading, and they're now aware that they fell out of the reading. That precipitates shame. Because again, they've been through this. They know, and again, the context of this from all concerns has caused them to feel ashamed of themselves over it. The shame dissipates the brain's energy. You can't feel shame and do something else really well while the shame's hitting you. The shame actually consumes and distracts the brain. So that causes them to disentrain or drop out of the kind of movement with reading that it takes to sustain the flow of reading, so they drop out of reading. This is very frustrating. In fact, God, I wish I could share more of just the kids how they speak about the frustration. The frustration reinforces this self-blame. The self-blame makes it easier for it to go to shame. So the more that they have this negative experience that's causing them to feel bad about themselves, the easier it is for the confusion to trigger the shame that knocks them out. As I said, and by the way, I grew up in the Bay Area. I love it being back here. I wish I could be back here more often. One of the experiences that I'll never forget happened in Concord, not more than a mile or two from here. I was in my 20s, and I was taking a walk with a newly elected brother-in-law. And we were out for a walk, getting to know each other, and we were walking in front of a bowling alley somewhere here in Concord. Right? I said, why don't we go bowling? He said, you know what? I tried that once, and I got a gutter ball, and I ain't never doing that again. And the full thing, that didn't hit me, okay, for years. But that's what's happening, right, is that we avoid the things that cause us to feel bad about ourselves. So all of this process is leading to the kids having an emotionally intelligent motive force that wants to avoid the shame and therefore avoid the reading that's triggering the shame. This feeds into their self-image. And this is when you get kids that are saying to themselves, I'm stupid, I'm not smart, I'll never get this. It's not that important, I'm going to be a sports star. Reading isn't going to be that big a deal in my life. All these machinations, all these formulas to develop a way to protect themselves from how they'd feel if they didn't. And of course, all of this leads to the self-talk story, like I was saying, of kind of they're punishing themselves. How kids talk to themselves is such a critical thing for educators to understand, because their self-talk is actually their primary learning environment. And once their self-talk starts to be punishing them, right, they're in deep trouble. All of this, of course, leads to the avoidance of reading. So, in our limited time, what can we do about all this? First of all, recognize that when a child is entering this window, 4 years old, 5 years old, to the 4th grade, they're in a danger zone. Their life's in danger. And that there's certain things that we can do to kind of improve their odds by changing their early learning trajectories. And that's why those parts of you, those people here that represent groups that are working in that, that's such incredibly important work. There's also new technological things that are coming along that are that exercise the brain to try to compensate for weak early trajectories. I mean, one of the problems is, how do you make up for missing 30 million words when you're 4 years old, 5 years old? How do you make up for that? Well, that requires you to be radically more neurologically efficient in exercising the brain in some way that would create approximately similar skills. Yeah? So there's systems that are starting to evolve to do that. The key to it all, though, is the family learning environment. And in another time that I hope that we'll all meet together, I hope to talk about how do we change the way parents see themselves, not just as teachers, but as stewards of the health, of the learning of their children, which is a different mission. So, but at the level that we get to them instructionally, outside of the family, coming into school, the first thing that I would argue and advocate for everybody who works with people directly in the learning to read space is learn to sync up with them. Don't try to teach them through a model that actually creates a distance between you and them. Don't throw a protocol at them. And that if you want to sync up with them, the first thing you got to realize, and you got to experience first person, rather than inferentially, because so-and-so said, the first thing is to realize that every start, stop, hesitation, stutter in the flow of their voice has a direct correspondence to a section of the code that their brain is stuttering in the processing of. And the more that sync between those two is actually first person clear to you, the better that everything you know about reading can intervene to help them. The further you are from that, the more you're throwing a model. The thing that's most important for everybody who's dealing with adolescence and further down the line is to recognize that their struggle that they're having now isn't with reading anymore. Their struggle is with their emotional avoidance of wanting to get into reading. You've got to reframe the context. You've got to reframe their experience of reading to give them a fresh start. They have to have hope that they can get through it, but they have to help them get out of the self-blame that's sabotaging their ability to learn. So you've got to help them understand parts of what I just did, and that's why these resources are available to you. You can take them through video after video of kids talking about the shame that they feel, or go back in time to talk about the emergence of the alphabet or how English came to be the way. Help them understand that if they're confused and they're struggling with this, it's in no way their fault. Take them out of the shame and blame that is disabling their ability to learn. If you just go on and you don't deal with that and just try to hammer them through instructionally, you're fighting against this entire emotional force in them that wants to avoid it. Probably the most profound thing I heard in interviewing the kids that I interviewed is how much, by the time they're in middle school and in high school, they would rather get F's on the tests than reveal to their teacher, to their parents, or to the kids around them the degree of their difficulty with reading. And what's happening is the reading is taking more time, so they can't get as far down in the assignments, in the work, and in the tests. But the shame is so powerful about this, and the conspiracy to avoid this conversation is so insidious throughout the classroom. I mean, I talked to many teachers who said, I don't have this problem in my classroom. Then I interview the kids, and when they finally open up, it's in huge contrast. So reframe the shame. Reframe the shame and sync up. In another occasion and more time, we could go into more things to do. For those of you that are actually on the line teaching first person, kids and adults who are struggling with this, I do have a teaching guide. It's not a how to teach, it's how to learn while you're teaching guide. How to learn your way into a deeper sync with what's going on. So if you remember that, and when you send in your little card, when you go to my webpage, what I said, you just remember, just say, I want to be a first person learner. That's the key secret word, right? Then I will send you those additional materials. So I'm actually got a minute or two left, and that's it. I'm sorry we couldn't cover more in our limited time. And I'll be here throughout lunch and would love to have a question and answer with anybody who's interested in any dimension of this or any of the things that are related to it. We do have an hour for now? Half an hour now. Oh, fantastic. We got time now. I should have read the agenda, huh? So, I'm sure you're full of questions. The question is, are you too ashamed to ask them, right?